This happened quite a while back, probably over 10 years ago when I was in the later years of high school, home alone. My parents were at a wedding and staying overnight at a hotel, and my brother was working the night shift. We lived in a well-known East Coast city in a blue-collar neighborhood that was starting to take a nosedive. As a teenager, I was a bit of a loner. Not exactly a nerd, though. I was a big guy with friends and went on dates. But being a natural introvert, I cherished the rare alone time. That weekend, I was looking forward to my usual solo routine: play some PlayStation on the big screen TV, order a late-night pizza or Chinese takeout, and binge-watch Dragon Ball Z. Then, around 2 a.m., I'd crash on the couch with my old dog, Cecil. Cecil was an ancient beagle who had been with us for about 8 years. Unlike most beagles, Cecil never howled or barked. He was a quiet, peaceful dog who spent most of his time begging for food or napping. He loved resting his head on my lap, which was exactly what he was doing that night. Around 1 a.m., I had just finished the last slice of pizza and was dozing off when I heard a loud bang coming from the back alley. I didn't think much of it. Anyone who's lived in the city knows there are noises at all hours. Cecil's head popped up, and the hair on his back stood on end. He was a bit skittish by nature, so I calmed him down and started to drift off again. But then, not 2 minutes later, another bang, this time louder. Cecil did something I'd never seen him do before. He leapt off the couch and bolted toward the door leading to the basement, barking and growling like a dog twice his size. It was as if he'd transformed into a K9 unit. And that sudden shift sent my adrenaline spiking. Through Cecil's barking, I could now make out a persistent banging. Our basement had an old, seldom-used door that led to the alleyway. It was rusted and hard to open, even with a key, and it made a ton of noise. That's when it hit me. Someone was trying to break into the house through the basement door. Quick tip for anyone who's never lived in a bad neighborhood: if someone tries a door and leaves when it's locked, they want your stuff. But if they're persistent, they want you. Realizing this, I rushed upstairs to grab the wooden baseball bat I kept under my bed for situations like this. Then, heart pounding, I headed down to the basement. I probably should have run or called for help, but I was a macho teenager with a tough guy complex, and besides, I didn't have anywhere else to go. Cecil, now acting like a dog half his age, blew past me down the stairs. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice say, "Oh no," and the banging stopped. I didn't call the cops, which, in hindsight, was incredibly stupid. Instead, I sat up the rest of the night, bat in hand. When my brother came home that morning, I told him what had happened. We went to check the basement door, and when we pulled it open, the whole thing fell off its hinges. Whoever had been outside was just one good shove away from getting in, but old Cecil had scared him off. I'm convinced that fat, lazy old dog saved my life. Whenever I tell people this story, they usually brush it off as a dog doing what dogs do. But trust me, Cecil never barked, and he definitely never moved that fast in his life. It was like he knew the urgency, like he understood that door wasn't going to hold much longer. A few years later, we had to put Cecil down. He was old, and his time had come. Right before the injection, I got a moment alone with him. I thanked him for being my friend, and for what he did that night. By then, I was a grown man with a wife and kids, things I'm not sure I would have had without Cecil's help that night. Throwaway for obvious reasons. I'm a SEAL, and at the time of this story, I was deployed. My wife and I own a house just outside Denver, where she stays with our kids when I'm overseas. She's a teacher, so during the summer, when she's off, she spends most of her time at home, since she's not a big people person. Our kids were in Florida with their grandparents for a couple of weeks, so it was just her at home. My wife never liked being alone, and I hated the thought of leaving her feeling scared or vulnerable. But I didn't have much of a choice. I made sure she knew how to handle all of my guns, and we had a security system, so I liked to believe she'd be safe, even on her own. One day, while she was out shopping, she noticed a truck following her. To confirm her suspicion, she drove in circles, and sure enough, the truck continued to tail her. Being smart, she memorized the license plate and drove straight to the nearest police station to file a report. Unfortunately, nothing could be done. She went home feeling a bit on edge, but tried to shake it off. My wife is very beautiful, and sadly, attracting unwanted attention is something she's somewhat used to. Later that evening, while making herself some buffalo chicken and watching Netflix, she heard a tapping sound on the window. She couldn't pinpoint the source, so she closed all the curtains and double-checked the locks before carrying on with her night. That night, while she was sleeping, she suddenly felt a cold, dirty hand clamp around her throat so tightly she couldn't speak. A large man was looming over her, but in the darkness, she couldn't make out his face. He barked at her to shut up and told her not to bite as he started undoing his belt. My wife reacted immediately. She kicked him hard in the stomach, breaking free from his grip, and threw herself off the bed. She grabbed the handgun from her nightstand, and although her memory of the event is blurry, she shot him point blank in the face. Incredibly, he kept coming at her, so she kept firing until he stopped moving. The police arrived quickly, and to this day, the man remains a John Doe. My wife wasn't charged with anything, and she has no regrets about what she did. What we can't figure out is how he got in without triggering the alarm. We believe he followed her home, somehow slipped into the house, and waited for his moment. I'm just incredibly thankful that our kids weren't home that night. Since then, we've adopted a German Shepherd and a Doberman and upgraded our security system. I'm so grateful I married a badass, and even more thankful she came out of this unharmed. I was 13 when this happened, and it still gives me nightmares. My parents wanted a date night, so they left me home alone on a Friday evening. I'm an only child, so being home alone wasn't anything new for me. We lived in a one-story house with a daylight basement that had its own entrance. Our neighborhood was quiet, especially in the evenings, and since we lived on a dead-end street with close neighbors, I didn't feel uncomfortable about staying by myself. My parents left around 6 p.m. for their dinner reservation. I had a hot pizza delivered and was ready to watch some scary movies alone. I was excited. After locking the door behind them, I settled in on the couch with my fuzzy blanket and started scrolling through my Roku, deciding on one of the Halloween movies to kick off the night. An hour or so passed and I got up to use the bathroom. While I was in there, I thought I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like something or someone was moving around down there. I brushed it off, thinking I was home alone, so it must just be my imagination. I finished up and went back to the couch to continue my movie. But then, just 5 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, the noise was more distinct. It sounded like movement, and I started to get that nervous feeling in the pit of my stomach. I paused the movie to listen more closely. Oh crap, what is that? My mind immediately went to the basement entrance. Was it locked? I assumed my parents had locked it before they left, but now I wasn't sure. I didn't know what to do. Taking a deep breath, I decided to check things out. I walked over to the door that led to the basement and pressed my ear against it. Big mistake. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. My heart sank, and I froze in absolute terror. I had been home alone before, but never at night, and never like this. The obvious thing would have been to call the police, but instead, I did the first thing that came to mind. I bolted out the front door and ran straight to my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, out of breath and terrified. Thankfully, they were home and let me in. It took me a minute to get the words out, but I finally managed to tell them someone was in my house and begged them to call the police. They immediately called 911, and within 10 minutes, the cops arrived. I called my parents to let them know what was happening while I stayed at my neighbor's, where I felt safe. The police checked the house while I waited anxiously next door. After some time, one of the officers came over and told us they didn't find anyone inside. However, they did discover that whoever it was had entered through the basement door, which had been unlocked. Nothing was taken, and the house appeared undisturbed, but the thought that someone had been in there with me still sent chills down my spine. My parents came home, understandably upset and shaken. The police assured us the house was clear, but reminded us to always lock our doors and windows, no matter how safe the neighborhood seems. They believed whoever it was had seen my parents leave and assumed the house was empty. I don't even want to think about the possibility that they knew I was home alone. Later, my mom realized she had probably forgotten to lock the basement door. She didn't think much of it because we lived in such a quiet neighborhood and rarely had issues. Needless to say, from that night on, we triple-checked every door and window before leaving the house. They still leave me alone sometimes, but now they make sure the neighbors know in case anything happens. Even now, at 16, I still feel uneasy when I'm home alone. I know I'll have to get over it eventually, but that night left its mark on me. So please, stay safe out there, and always lock your doors. You never know who might be lurking around your neighborhood. I was about 12 years old, home alone while my parents were out doing my homework. After about 30 minutes, I heard a knock at the door. Assuming it was my parents, I looked out the window and saw it was my friend. Let's call him Matthew, who was my age. He explained that his parents were also out and he wanted to hang out. Now, my parents always told me not to have anyone over while they were gone, but I figured it'd be fine, so I let him in. We headed downstairs to play video games. After about an hour, we went upstairs to grab some Oreos and then returned to the basement. Not long after, I heard a creaking noise. I immediately muted the TV and stared at Matthew, who heard it too. Matthew, being the braver of the two of us, grabbed a small bat I'd been playing with earlier, about the size of my arm, and we cautiously made our way upstairs. There was nothing there, but I chalked it up to the fact that my house was old and made weird noises from time to time. But then I had a mischievous idea. I suggested to Matthew that we should check the upstairs more thoroughly. As he looked in my brother's closet, I snuck over to mine. Since I was a big mask collector, I grabbed a mask like the ones from The Purge, election year with X's over the eyes. I put it on and waited behind a wall near my brother's room. When Matthew finally stepped out of the closet and turned toward me, his eyes widened in shock, and he let out the loudest scream, like a terrified little kid who'd just seen a ghost. But then I realized something was wrong. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring down the hallway toward my parents' room. I turned to look, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing there was a tall man, at least 6 feet, wearing one of my masks, a Pennywise mask. I felt ice-cold chills flood through my body. Just like Matthew, I screamed as loud as I could. The worst part was my parents' room was right next to the stairs, blocking our only escape route. I was frozen in terror, unsure of what to do, until I felt someone yank me into my brother's room. It was Matthew. He slammed the door and jammed a chair under the knob. Frantically, we searched for anything to defend ourselves. Matthew grabbed his bat and smashed the window. Perfect idea, I thought. He jumped out first. As I climbed up to follow him, I looked back one last time. The man was standing right there, staring straight at me, a kitchen knife in his hand. I let out another scream and leaped through the window. Matthew and I sprinted to a neighbor's house, telling them everything that had just happened. The cops came and searched the house, but they found nothing, just another broken window. My parents were freaked out when they came home. That night, as I lay in their bed, I kept thinking about how lucky I was that Matthew had that bat, and what could have happened if that chair hadn't held up. Thank you for watching.